If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you, millionaire mocks black girl, but then. The marble floor of the grand ballroom reflected the crystal chandeliers like a frozen lake catching starlight. Marcus Thornfield stood at the center of it all, his champagne glass raised high, his voice cutting through the elegant music like a blade through silk. If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you, he announced, his words dripping with mockery as he stared down at the small girl standing at the edge of the crowd. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes people shift in their expensive shoes and exchange worried glances behind their wine glasses. The girl's name was Maya, and she was only 9 years old. Her worn dress hung loose on her thin frame, clearly borrowed from someone bigger, and her feet were covered in cheap canvas shoes that had seen better days. She had come to the mansion that evening not as a guest but as the granddaughter of Joseph, the man who had been cleaning these marble floors for 20 years. Joseph had brought her along because he had no one to watch her that night, and he thought she could wait quietly in the kitchen while he worked. But Maya had heard the music floating through the walls, and like any child drawn to beauty, she had wandered into the ballroom, clutching an old music box her mother had left her before she passed away. Marcus Thornfield was known throughout the city not just for his billions but for his cruelty wrapped in charm. He had built his empire by crushing smaller companies, and he wore his ruthlessness like an expensive cologne. When he spotted Maya at the edge of his grand charity gala, something in him stirred, not compassion, but the desire to remind everyone of the vast distance between them. Go back to wherever you crawled out from. That's where you belong, isn't it? With the dust and the mops. Maya stood there, her small hands trembling slightly, but her dark eyes never left Marcus's face. She was thinking of her grandmother's words from just last week, before she had passed away too, leaving Maya with only her grandfather Joseph. When they try to make you small, her grandmother had said, you stand tall. When they try to break you, you dance. Those words echoed in Maya's mind now as she looked at this man who thought her poverty made her less than human. She could hear the whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through leaves. Some guests were appalled by Marcus's behavior, others were embarrassed, and a few were even amused. But Maya heard none of them clearly. All she heard was the music from her mother's music box, playing in her memory. She's actually going to do it, someone whispered in disbelief as Maya took a step forward. Then another. Her grandfather Joseph stood frozen by the service door, his weathered hands gripping his cleaning cart so tight his knuckles had turned white. He wanted to rush forward, to protect his granddaughter from this humiliation, but he also knew that interfering might cost him his job, and they needed that job to survive. Maya reached the center of the ballroom, her small figure dwarfed by the enormous space and the crowd of adults in their glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. She looked up at Marcus, who towered over her like a mountain of expensive fabric and cold pride. I'm not a mouse, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room with surprising strength. My name is Maya. And you don't scare me, Mr. Thornfield, because people who are truly strong don't need to make others feel small. The crowd reached into her pocket and pulled out her music box, the paint chipped and faded but the mechanism still working. She wound it up with careful fingers and set it on the marble floor. The tinkling melody of a waltz began to play, thin and fragile in the vast space, but somehow perfect in its simplicity. I'll dance, Maya said, lifting her chin. Not because you dared me, but because my mother taught me that dancing is how we show the world our soul. And my soul, Mr. Thornfield, is worth more than all the money in this room. As Maya began to move to the tinny music of her music box, something extraordinary happened. She didn't dance like a trained ballerina or like someone who had taken expensive lessons. She danced like a child who had learned by standing on her mother's feet in their tiny kitchen, swaying to the radio while soup bubbled on the stove. Her movements were imperfect but genuine, clumsy but full of heart. She turned and swayed, her arms moving with a grace that came not from training but from pure emotion. The music box played on, its melody competing with the silence of the room, and Maya danced as if she were alone in the world, as if the marble floor were grass and the chandeliers were stars. Then, from the crowd, a boy stepped forward. His name was Oliver, and he was Marcus Thornfield's own nephew, visiting from boarding school. Oliver was 12, with sandy hair and clothes that cost more than most people made in a month, but his eyes held a kindness that money couldn't buy. "I want to dance with her," he announced, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness but determined nonetheless. His mother, Marcus's sister Patricia, hissed at him from her table, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Oliver, you will return to your seat this instant." But Oliver ignored her, walking across the floor to where Maya danced alone. "You shouldn't have to dance by yourself," Oliver said quietly, extending his hand to Maya. She looked at him with surprise, searching his face for mockery but finding only sincerity. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Your uncle will be angry." Oliver glanced at Marcus, whose face had turned an interesting shade of red, then back at Maya. "Some things are more important than not making adults angry," he said, and Maya smiled for the first time that evening. They began to dance together, two children in a room full of adults who had forgotten what it meant to be brave. Their dance wasn't perfect. Oliver had been trained in formal waltz steps at his expensive school, while Maya moved to the rhythm in her heart. They stepped on each other's feet more than once, and at one point Oliver tripped slightly, catching himself on Maya's shoulder. But they laughed, quiet giggles that seemed to break something open in the room. Some of the younger guests began to smile, and a few even started to clap softly to the rhythm of the music box. The melody was coming to an end, the spring inside the old box winding down, but Maya and Oliver kept moving, dancing now to the rhythm of their own making. When they finally stopped, breathing hard and grinning at each other, the room was different. The cold judgment that had filled it moments before had cracked like ice in spring. Maya turned to face Marcus, who stood there with his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. "Well," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I danced your waltz, Mr. Thornfield. I didn't stumble and fall. So now what? Will you keep your word, or are your promises as empty as your heart seems to be?" The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what the billionaire would do when challenged by a 9-year-old girl. Marcus's jaw clenched and unclenched as he looked at this child who had turned his cruel game into something else entirely. He had expected her to run away crying or to stumble and fall, giving him and his guests something to laugh about later. He had not expected courage. He had not expected dignity. And he certainly had not expected his own nephew to stand against him. The room waited, heavy with expectation, as Marcus set down his champagne glass with a sharp click against a nearby table. "I always keep my word," he said slowly, though his voice sounded like it was being dragged across gravel. "But adoption is a legal process that takes time. We'll discuss the details tomorrow." Joseph finally found his voice and his courage, stepping forward from the service door. "Mr. Thornfield," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "Maya is my granddaughter. She has a home with me. She doesn't need your charity or your adoption. What she needed tonight was to show you and everyone here that being poor doesn't mean being without worth. I think she's done that quite well." The old man's eyes were bright with tears of pride as he looked at his granddaughter, who had faced down one of the most powerful men in the city with nothing but an old music box and the courage her mother and grandmother had instilled in her. Marcus looked between Joseph and Maya, something flickering in his eyes that might have been shame, though he would never admit it. The crowd was watching him, and not with the usual admiration or fear, but with something else. They were seeing him differently now, through the lens of a child's bravery. His sister Patricia stood up from her table, her face still flushed but now with anger rather than embarrassment. "Marcus, this is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering," but Marcus raised his hand, silencing her. "The girl danced," he said simply. "She met my challenge. What happened next would be talked about in the city's social circles for years to come." Marcus Thornfield, the man who had never apologized for anything in his life, walked across the marble floor to where Maya stood with her grandfather. He didn't kneel down to her level, that would have been too much for his pride to bear, but he did something almost as remarkable. He extended his hand to her for a handshake, as if she were an equal, a business partner rather than a child in a borrowed dress. "You've taught me something tonight," he said quietly, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "Though I'm not entirely sure I wanted to learn it." Maya looked at his extended hand for a moment, then shook it with a firm grip that surprised him. "Learning things we don't want to learn is how we grow," she said, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "My grandmother taught me that." The handshake lasted only a moment, but photographers from the society pages captured it, and by morning it would be on the front page of every newspaper in the city. The billionaire and the janitor's granddaughter, shaking hands as equals while a crowd of the city's elite watched in stunned silence. Over the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen at the Thornfield Corporation. Marcus, who had always been ruthless in his business dealings, began to show small signs of change. He didn't become a saint overnight, that would have been too much to expect, but he started a scholarship program for underprivileged children, named after Maya's grandmother. He claimed it was for tax purposes, but those close to him noticed he took personal interest in selecting the recipients. Maya herself was offered the first scholarship, which would pay for her education all the way through university. Joseph was promoted from janitor to head of maintenance, with a salary that meant they could move out of their cramped apartment into a real house with a garden where Maya could play. But the most surprising change came from Oliver, Marcus's nephew. He and Maya became unlikely friends, and he would often invite her to the mansion, not as the janitor's granddaughter, but as his friend. They would dance together in the ballroom sometimes, when it was empty, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. Patricia was horrified at first, but even she couldn't deny that her son seemed happier, less isolated in his world of privilege. He was learning from Maya things that his expensive boarding school could never teach him, about resilience, about joy that didn't come from money, about the strength that comes from facing hardship with grace. Maya never forgot that night when she danced the waltz in front of all those people who thought she was less than them. But she also never let it define her. She grew up to become a doctor, using the education that Marcus's scholarship provided to help children in the same poor neighborhood where she had grown up. She would tell them the story sometimes, when they needed to hear it, about the night she danced in a mansion and changed a billionaire's heart, even if only a little. She would tell them that courage isn't about not being afraid, she had been terrified that night, but about dancing anyway, even when your shoes are worn and your dress doesn't fit right. Years later, when Marcus was an old man and his empire had been transformed into something that actually helped people rather than just making money, he would sometimes stand in that ballroom alone, remembering the night a 9-year-old girl in a borrowed dress taught him about true worth. He had the music box repaired and placed in a glass case in the ballroom, with a plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest among us dance with the greatest courage." He would wind it up occasionally and let it play, the tinkling melody filling the vast space, and he would remember Maya's words about souls being worth more than money. Joseph lived to see his granddaughter graduate from medical school, tears streaming down his weathered face as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. In her acceptance speech, she thanked many people, but she ended with this: "To my grandfather, who taught me that honest work has dignity. To my mother and grandmother, who taught me to dance even in sorrow. And to Marcus Thornfield, who reminded me that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with grace, not with anger but with the simple act of refusing to be made small." The audience erupted in applause, not knowing the full story but sensing the power in her words. Oliver went on to take over the Thornfield Corporation when Marcus retired, but he ran it very differently than his uncle had. He remembered the lessons learned from a girl who danced to a music box, and he made sure the company's success lifted others rather than crushing them. He and Maya remained friends throughout their lives, and when he married, Maya was there, and when she married, he was there. They would sometimes joke about that night, about how a waltz changed everything, but they both knew it wasn't really a joke. It had changed everything. The mansion still stands today, converted into a community center where children from all backgrounds can come to learn music and dance. The ballroom where it all happened is the main practice space, and if you look carefully, you can see small scuff marks on the marble floor that the staff never buff out. They're from a pair of cheap canvas shoes that danced one night long ago, when a girl named Maya proved that true worth isn't measured in money or marble floors, but in the courage to stand tall when the world tries to make you small. The music box still sits in its case, and sometimes, when the center is closed and the lights are dim, the janitor who cleans there, a young man who heard the story from his grandmother, winds it up and lets it play, filling the space with its tinkling melody and the memory of a dance that changed hearts. Marcus Thornfield passed away on a spring morning, surrounded not by business associates but by recipients of the scholarship program he had started. Maya was there, holding his hand as he took his final breaths. His last words were, "Tell them about the dance." And she did. She told them all about the night when, "If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you," turned from mockery into a moment of transformation. She told them about a millionaire who mocked a black girl, but then found his assumptions shattered by her courage and grace. She told them that change is possible, even in the hardest hearts, if we have the courage to dance our truth in front of those who would deny it. The story spread far beyond their city, inspiring other children to stand up to bullies, other wealthy people to examine their prejudices, and other communities to build bridges where there had been walls. Maya established a foundation called the Dance of Dignity, that provided not just scholarships but mentorship, teaching children that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances but by their character. The foundation's logo was a simple music box, painted in gold, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can play the most powerful melodies. In schools across the country, teachers began using Maya's story as a lesson about courage, prejudice, and the power of standing up for yourself with grace rather than aggression. Children would act out the scene, taking turns being Maya, Marcus, Oliver, and Joseph, learning through play about dignity and respect. The story became a reminder that discrimination often comes from fear and ignorance, and that sometimes, the best way to combat it is not with anger but with the simple act of being undeniably, unapologetically yourself. The waltz itself became symbolic in the community. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, the community center holds a waltz night where everyone is invited, regardless of their ability to dance or their ability to pay. People come in their best clothes or their everyday clothes, in designer shoes or bare feet, and they all dance together on the same marble floor where it all began. Marcus's portrait hangs on the wall, not the stern businessman he had been, but a painting done near the end of his life, where his eyes held warmth and perhaps a hint of gratitude for the lesson learned from a brave little girl. Maya, now in her 60s, still visits the center regularly. She teaches dance classes to children who remind her of herself at 9 years old, frightened but brave, poor in material wealth but rich in spirit. She tells them that dancing isn't about perfect steps or expensive lessons. It's about moving to the rhythm of your own heart, about expressing joy even in the face of those who would deny you that joy. She teaches them the waltz, but more importantly, she teaches them what her grandmother taught her: when they try to make you small, you stand tall; when they try to break you, you dance. The music box, carefully preserved and still functional, is brought out on special occasions. When it plays its simple melody, everyone stops to listen, remembering or learning for the first time about the night when a challenge meant to humiliate became a moment of triumph. The children who hear the story often ask Maya if she was scared that night. She always tells them the truth: "I was terrified. My knees were shaking, and I wanted to run away." But sometimes, the most important things we do in life are the things we do while we're afraid. The scholarship program that Marcus started has sent hundreds of children to college, children who might otherwise have never had the chance. Many of them go on to become doctors, teachers, engineers, and artists, but all of them carry with them the story of Maya's dance. They know that they are part of a legacy that began with mockery but was transformed into something beautiful through courage and grace. They know that their education was paid for not just with money, but with the price of prejudice overcome and hearts changed. Oliver, now retired himself, often speaks at business conferences about corporate responsibility and the importance of seeing beyond profit margins to the human impact of business decisions. He always begins his talks with the story of the dance, of how his uncle's cruel joke became the catalyst for transformation not just for Marcus, but for their entire company and community. He speaks about his friend Maya, who taught him that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in the positive impact we have on others' lives. The neighborhood where Maya grew up has been transformed too, not through gentrification that pushes out long-time residents, but through investment that lifts up the people who already live there. The Thornfield Corporation, under Oliver's leadership and now continued by his daughter, partnered with community organizations to create jobs, improve schools, and build affordable housing that allows families to stay in their homes. It's not perfect, no neighborhood is, but it's better, and that improvement can be traced back to a single dance on a marble floor. Sometimes, journalists come to interview Maya about that night, wanting to know if she harbors any resentment toward Marcus for his initial cruelty. She always smiles and shakes her head. Resentment is like trying to dance while carrying heavy stones, she says. It weighs you down and keeps you from moving freely. Marcus was a man trapped by his own prejudices and fears. That night, we both learned something. He learned that worth isn't determined by wealth, and I learned that sometimes, the people who seem the strongest are actually the most afraid. We both grew from that encounter. As this story comes to its close, the message rings clear through every word and memory: dignity cannot be bought or sold, courage cannot be mocked into submission, and sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin not with violence or angry words, but with a child's decision to dance in the face of derision. Maya's waltz that night was more than just movement to music, it was a declaration that every human being, regardless of their circumstances, possesses inherent worth that no amount of money or mockery can diminish. Today, if you visit that community center and stand in the ballroom as the afternoon light streams through the tall windows, you might feel something in the air, a sense of possibility, of courage, of transformation. The marble floor that once reflected only the expensive shoes of the elite now reflects the worn sneakers of children learning to dance, the work boots of parents attending evening classes, the dress shoes of young people preparing for job interviews through the center's professional development program. It reflects a community that learned from one brave girl that when someone says, "If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you," as a cruel joke, the best response is to dance with such grace and dignity that the whole world stops to watch and learn. The story of Maya and Marcus, of Joseph and Oliver, of a music box and a waltz, reminds us that change is possible, that hearts can be softened, that prejudice can be overcome. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest among us carry the greatest lessons, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to dance anyway. It reminds us that when a millionaire mocks a black girl, but then witnesses her unshakable dignity and grace, transformation becomes not just possible but inevitable. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we all have the power to dance our own waltz, to stand tall in the face of those who would diminish us, and to teach through our actions that every soul has immeasurable worth. In the end, Marcus never did adopt Maya, she didn't need him to. She had Joseph, who loved her fiercely, and the memory of her mother and grandmother, whose strength flowed through her veins. What Marcus gave her, through the scholarship and the changes that followed, was opportunity. But what Maya gave Marcus, and everyone who witnessed her dance that night, was far more valuable. She gave them a mirror in which to see their own prejudices, and more importantly, the possibility of becoming better than they were. And that is why, years later, the story is still told, the music box still plays, and children still learn to dance on that marble floor, because some lessons are too important to be forgotten, and some dances echo through generations.